So my name is Alec, Christie. I'm a research fellow at Downing College at the University of Cambridge, and I work with the Conservation Evidence Group.
Yeah, and I'm Tom White. I'm also in the Conservation Evidence Group. I'm a PhD student, looking at how we can better measure the cost effectiveness of conservation actions.
So what we did in this study was to look at the publication delays that affect papers that are testing the effectiveness of different conservation interventions and actions. So what we did was we used the Conservation Evidence Database, which is a massive set of studies that have been collated by researchers in our group through searching different conservation journals. And what we've managed to do is extract the dates of publication, but also the dates when the data collection for those studies ended. So what this allows us to do is work out how long studies were essentially delayed for before they were published. And so we looked at lots of different aspects of how that delay varies, so how it varies by different conservation subjects, so bird conservation versus amphibian conservation, for example. We looked at how the delay is different between different publication sources, so different literatures, like the peer-reviewed literature versus the non-peer-reviewed literature. We also looked at how the delay has changed over time, so has it increased or decreased, or has it stayed the same? And finally, we looked at how the delay is influenced by the threatened species that the study investigates. So are more threatened species subject to studies that test interventions on threatened species? Are they subject to shorter or longer delays? And finally, we also looked at some general data on publication delays that occur at journals. So how long does it take for a journal from the date a study was submitted to when it was actually published, to get kind of a general overview of the sort of speed at which journals in conservation and related fields publish studies.
So we found that after looking at publication delays in these papers, the overall delay, so the time between the end of data collection and publication in its final journal, was surprisingly large. It was 3.2 years overall. And I think that's we found that quite a concerning finding generally, because 3.2 years is a really long time for a mission-driven discipline such as conservation science. In 3.2 years, a population could decline quite significantly. A new threat could emerge that needs to be tackled if you're going to stop that species declining or that species going extinct, for example. And yeah, when we looked further into this, we found that that delay was partitioned between time between the end of data collection and submission, so that there are delays in the write-up and analysis process and in getting it to a stage where you can actually submit it to journals. But there are also a large proportion of delays explained by the difference between submitting to your first journal and the final journal, and actually it being published. So there are problems in the publishing process as well that's preventing this useful data that shows whether a conservation intervention is effective or not actually getting out there to the end users who can use it to improve practice. So we think that's quite a significant finding, and we make recommendations at the end of the paper, or we come up with a set of possible solutions that could help reduce these different components of delays for funders, for practitioners, for scientists, and for people involved in the publishing process.
One anecdote we've got about this particular study, which is quite ironic because it looks at publication delays, is the fact that our paper itself was delayed in our attempts to get it published. So the first problem we faced was when we selected a kind of novel sort of publishing system to try out to see if we could get our study published quicker, which was called PeerJ of Science. And when we submitted it, it looked like it was still active, but unfortunately we found out about a month later that the scheme had enough interest and had closed. So we were delayed by about a month, when we thought our paper was being reviewed and looked at, but actually was just sitting there. So that was quite an ironic problem that we faced in our own publication delays and getting our paper published. So yeah, that was quite a funny process to go through for our study.
What kind of lessons do you hope your readers take away from this research? So I think from our experience, many researchers sort of across disciplines in the university have horror stories about the difficulty in getting work published, and often that it can take a long time, as we found in this study, or in the worst case scenario, it actually never does get published. People have changing priorities and struggle to get through the publishing process. So what I think we hope people take away from this is that this is a big problem in conservation science, and possibly there's other literature showing that this is also an issue in other disciplines. And so we hope that people look at some of the possible solutions at reducing delay that we propose at the end of the paper, and think about how we can improve the write-up process, how we can improve the submission and peer review process, so that the important data that's collected by scientists testing conservation interventions, giving that information on whether something actually works or whether it doesn't work, can actually get out there to the people who need it, who can use it to improve their decision making. And ultimately, if that does get used, then that creates better conservation outcomes, which is something that we hope to do as a result of this sort of work.
So we first selected PeerJ because what we've done with this paper is submitted it as a preprint to a preprint server called bioRxiv, and we noticed that not only was PeerJ just a suitable venue for our study in terms of its remit and its scope, but it was also directly linked to bioRxiv. So what we could do is just transfer the paper from bioRxiv to PeerJ without having to fill in a separate submission process. So to us, that made a lot of sense in terms of speeding up the publication of our study, which had already been delayed. And once I looked at the PeerJ website as well, I sort of looked a bit more at the ways in which they're trying to speed up the publication process and looked at their review times, and it seemed to be quite a good venue